Thank you very much also for picking this topic, which I think is a really good one, as I was mentioning at the beginning. Because within the G20, we're quite fond of saying that the G20 countries, members of the G20, account for 80 or 85% of global GDP. But we also do remember that it's just 20 countries, and there are many other countries that are not in the G20. And I think there are a couple of ways that the leaders of the G20 sort of in a process sense reach out beyond just the G20. One is that typically the host of the G20 in any one year will invite some other countries, often neighboring countries or countries with whom they have strong relations, to join in the meetings and the preparations and so on. We also, of course, have representatives from regional organizations that attend all of the Sherpa meetings, that prepare for the summit, and then also come to the summit. And we also, or the leaders also, spend at least some of their time thinking, and I would say that amount of time has increased, thinking about how what the G20 does is going to affect countries outside the G20. And there are some countries in particular that we were discussing earlier about South Africa. South Africa clearly feels in some representative role for some of Africa. And sometimes there can be, Indonesia is there as an ASEAN country and clearly has some sort of sense of the regional importance. But I was also just saying before we began formally that I believe that this year's chair, Turkey, is particularly interested in looking beyond the G20 and thinking about how the issues that the G20 itself are considering may impact on countries outside the G20, middle-income and low-income countries in particular that are outside the G20. Of course, there are high-income countries outside the G20, but I think we don't spend so much time thinking about them. This is a great time also to have this discussion because, as you know, the Brisbane Summit was just last month, not even a full month ago, but already people are starting to think about 2015. The Turkish presidency has already sent out some notes on their key themes. Just this morning, actually, I had a conversation with Ayşe Sinirlioglu, who is the who's the Sherpa for Turkey and will be running all of those meetings and keeping up a great tradition of the part. This is the fourth year that the Sherpa group has been chaired by a woman.
All right.
Which is quite surprising. It actually led one of the men last time to claim that there was a majority of women, although that was far from true, but I think they sort of felt the power. But we do, one of the things that is important to remember about the G20 is that it is a dynamic body, and so it responds to the issues of the day, as well as building on work that is carried out throughout the year. Now, one of the issues of the day that has an enormous impact or potential impact on middle and low-income countries, or particularly some countries in Africa, that was picked up and discussed in Brisbane was Ebola. And we ended up with, this was obviously not something that was discussed throughout the year. It was something that came up just a few months before the summit, that the international response really kicked into high gear even closer to the summit, pushed in large part, I think, by President Obama. And then by the time that the G20 then became a very useful mechanism from our point of view for raising consciousness and raising contributions towards the Ebola threat. Now, it wasn't the leading in our government. I was not the lead person on Ebola, but I was the lead person for making sure that this got full attention in the G20 and was raised to leaders at that level. And in the end, there was a very strong statement about Ebola at the time of Brisbane, which had sort of two elements. One was directly about what we should do about and what governments and countries were committed to do about Ebola. And then the other was, what should we be doing doing and encouraging to have done on the much broader issue, which is of very great importance to many low-income and middle-income countries, which is health systems and health security. And we put in place a sort of request for reporting back on how this work was going forward. Again, not just the work on Ebola itself, but the work on putting in place in a timely fashion the kinds of health systems that would allow countries to respond more quickly, more effectively, and with less tragic loss of life to future diseases. And I think, as people have said, in today's globalized world, we've had SARS, we've had MERS, and now with much greater loss of life, Ebola, and we know that these kinds of issues are global issues and not just isolated. And of course they are relevant for the sort of global conscience of leaders. I noticed just on a quick read through this report that there's a comment that is the G20 was very good and I think very effective at the time and the years immediately after the global financial crisis. And I think even leaders and people like me, officials working, Sherpas working on the G20, will recognize that it is easier to grab attention and to drive actions when in the face of a crisis. But the G20 has been grappling with the fact that there isn't an immediate crisis in the global economy, and has not been for a couple of years. But that does not mean that there are not underlying problems that, if not addressed, can lead to a crisis, or that there may be crises that are not of a fast-moving financial kind, but are certainly a crisis for the people in our countries. So the first thing that I would say that we have worked over a number of years to bring to the top of the G20 agenda, and I think it is now at the top of the G20 agenda, is the issue of jobs. Jobs and growth, obviously, closely connected. We have a recognition, leaders have a recognition in the G20 statement that was issued in Brisbane that in addition to the structural reforms that are widely considered to be needed to strengthen long-term growth, and in addition to the investments that are needed, there is a shortfall, a global shortfall in demand that countries need to address, and that we certainly believe that global growth remains too weak and remains in particular a challenge which I think Turkey will be ready to pick up, that growth has not been evenly distributed, or rather the incomes from the recovery such as it has come have not been equally distributed across countries and within countries. And of course, one important sort of measure of distribution is also about what's happening in low-income countries. Now, in the United States, of course, the economic recovery is continuing and the economy is healing. We can see that. But this is not, and there are the places where I would say there are the most challenge are actually in the advanced countries as well, in Japan and Europe. But there are many countries in the middle, emerging markets and low-income countries, where we really want to be able to offer up the prospect of a more rapidly growing global economy that will be more welcoming to the exports from the poorer countries, and will help to drive growth and job creation in those economies. Another big important area which I think has really applies to countries at all income levels, including low income, and where I think the G20 work can have positive spillovers is on investment, and particularly infrastructure investment. And we in the United States have, of course, promoted Power Africa to provide energy access within Africa, and to bring together the private sector financing that we know is available, but may fear the risks involved in developing and investing long-term in some lower income and middle income countries. So we are pushing within the G20, and the G20 itself has taken on this challenge of trying to see how we can promote more investment, particularly in infrastructure. And in all of our countries, whether it's Indonesia, India, or the United States, we all recognize that we have an infrastructure deficit. And the methods of combining the funds that may be available but are not typically from governments with the needs of many of our countries, I think there are many ways to that those lessons can be applied to lower middle income countries as well as the more advanced economies in the G20. Third issue is on the financial system. Now, typically, the most advanced financial systems are in the advanced economies, but we have seen how a problem there and a lack of resilience there can have very bad effects on the overall global economy. And the work that has been done, which is maybe not so flashy for the headlines, but there's been a lot of work done by bank regulators and central bankers and finance ministry officials over the past several years in the G20 context to promote stronger, more resilient financial systems that will not fall into the kind of crisis that we saw before. Fourth element is on trade, energy, and climate. And these are areas where traditionally in the negotiating space of obviously trade issues are not negotiated in the G20, they're negotiated in the WTO on the multilateral basis, and then there are other regional mechanisms where countries work on these issues. Climate is also discussed in the UN and UN bodies, not in the G20. But in the G20, it's possible to have a kind of political push to dealing with these issues in a way that can be helpful to move negotiators perhaps out of entrenched positions towards a place where there is better agreement. And I think that is strongly in the interests in a globalized world of the low-income and middle-income countries. We were successful in the G20 in 2013 in pushing for a multilateral trade agreement on trade facilitation, which was truly a win-win, and which led to a success in Bali in December 2013, but of course implementation was held up by a lot of concerns from India. Around the time of this year's G20 meeting, there was an announcement that the work was likely to be able to move forward in the WTO, and this was extremely positive. And I think that multilateral space was a good one to make this kind of progress, which again is going to be useful for all countries. Similarly, climate change is affecting, and we see, just this past week with another typhoon in the Philippines, we see that climate changes can hit wealthy people in New York or people in low-income countries and middle-income countries elsewhere indiscriminately. And we know that this is a global challenge that needs to be worked on together. One of the very positive things about Brisbane, I think, was that a number of countries, well, we in Japan, announced our pledges to the Green Climate Fund there. And I'm glad to say that that helped, I think, to spur more pledges in the climate discussions that have been taking place in Lima this week, including, interestingly, yesterday from Australia, which had, yes.
Good work, Jackie. Good job.
And that was certainly not what anybody would have expected to happen several months ago. And I think the discussions in the G20 really helped to shift the debate there in Australia.
Word on the street is that it was single-handedly Obama's work. Now, I don't know the truth of it, but that's the rumor we're promoting.
Right. Well, it's certainly, that is an issue that the president cares very deeply about, and where I think that, that increasingly in the old days, it was clear that, some of us, and obviously the United States, and actually also Australia, on a per capita basis, had been responsible for putting the carbon in the atmosphere, but now it's increasingly clear that there are other countries, as they're growing, unless they grow in a carbon efficient, maybe even carbon neutral way, they will be suffering. And we've seen in China, air quality is a big issue. I think in India, there's growing concern about air quality issues, and the new Prime Minister has certainly called for and made a point in his own state of combining both energy access with a big increase in renewables. So I think that debate can also, and the G20 can provide a place where some of the big players do things that are in the interests of the globe, and then also in the rest of the world. I just want to touch on one other issue which I think has been very important, but where on all of these we need to do more to reach out to make sure that the actions that are considered in the G20 also have a positive spillover effect for low-income countries. And another area is on taxes, and you and others here have made a big contribution in terms of raising this issue. And I think it first came up that in the context of resources extraction in many countries, where there's a sense that governments didn't get the resources that and the tax revenues that they should have. And now there is this very big multilateral negotiations that the OECD has sort of hosted that really have wrestled a lot of these difficult issues about BEPS, base erosion and profit shifting. There's more work to be done. It's very difficult, but I think that there has been, this is an area where there can be a lot of help for low-income countries and middle-income countries, and there's a stream of the work that is particularly aimed to help lower income. I'll just say one other thing on the financial area. Financial inclusion is obviously very important for low-income countries, and there, we made a bold push for halving the cost of remittances as a commitment several years ago, which we have not succeeded in doing. And this past year, we in the United States said, okay, we haven't done it within 5 years, but we're not going to just let that anniversary go by and hope that nobody notices. We're going to, peeling it, tempting as that might have been, we're going to actually see why did we not meet it? What can we do on a country by country basis to make progress? And yes, there are genuine tensions between making financial systems, protecting them from misuse by terrorist groups or criminals, and making sure that you don't have such controls that they're harder to use for poorer individuals that need to use them, and especially on the remittances flows, which can be very, incredibly important to lower income people in some recipient countries. So we managed, and interestingly, some of the countries that you might not necessarily think of as being opponents of this, or there are a number of countries in the G20 that are largely where they have the people working there who send remittances out. And South Africa is one of those, for example, as well as Saudi Arabia and a number of other countries that are not just like the United States or somewhere. Anyway, we managed to get right at the end agreement on doing national action plans on remittances. conferences, which I think will be very important. So I'll stop there. Obviously, there are an enormous number of things that I could go on talking about, but I want to give time to the other panelists and also to all of you to ask some questions.